Picture this. You're at your brother's engagement party, surrounded by champagne glasses and string quartets, when your own father grabs the microphone and decides to roast your relationship in front of the entire social elite of your hometown. Not just a little teasing between family members, but a full-blown public humiliation session where your boyfriend becomes the punchline and you become the family disappointment. That happened to me 6 months ago at the Riverside Country Club in California. My parents didn't just disapprove of my boyfriend Marcus, they turned him into entertainment for 150 of the most influential people in our community. They mocked his job, his clothes, his truck, and basically everything about him that didn't fit their picture-perfect image of who their daughter should be dating. But here's the thing about assumptions. They have a funny way of backfiring spectacularly. Because while my family was busy laughing at the man I loved, they had absolutely no idea who he really was. And when the truth came out that night, it didn't just silence the room, it changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Miller, and I need to tell you about the night my world turned completely upside down. Not in a bad way, though it started that way. In the most beautiful, justice-serving, karma-delivering way you could possibly imagine. I'm 28 years old, born and raised in Riverside, California, which is one of those suburban communities where everyone knows everyone else's business, and your family's reputation follows you around like a shadow. My father, Dr. Richard Miller, runs the most successful medical practice in town, and my mother, Patricia, sits on every charity board worth mentioning. They're what you'd call pillars of the community, the kind of people who host garden parties, and know exactly which fork to use for which course. Growing up as their daughter meant living under a microscope. Every outfit was scrutinized, every friend was evaluated, every decision was measured against how it would reflect on the Miller family name. My older brother, Kevin, mastered this game perfectly. He became a financial advisor, drives a BMW, lives in the right neighborhood, and just got engaged to Amanda Harrison, whose father happens to be the most powerful attorney in Riverside. Kevin is basically the golden child who never stepped out of line. And then there's me. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a rebel or a troublemaker. I work in marketing for a mid-sized firm, I have my own apartment, I pay my bills on time, and I've never been arrested or caused any major scandals. But I've also never quite fit the mold my parents carved out for me. I prefer coffee shops to country clubs, hiking boots to high heels, and genuine conversations to networking events. 2 years ago, I met Marcus Rodriguez, and everything about my carefully ordered world shifted. We met at the most ordinary place you could imagine, a laundromat on a Sunday afternoon. I was sitting there with a broken washing machine at home, reading a book and waiting for my clothes to finish, when this guy walked in carrying a toolbox. He wasn't there to do laundry. The elderly woman who owned the place had called him because one of the machines was making terrible noises, and Marcus had dropped everything to come fix it for free. I watched him work for 20 minutes, explaining each step to Mrs. Chen so she'd know what to look for next time, refusing to take any payment, and making her laugh with stories about his nephew's latest soccer game. When he finally noticed me staring, he walked over with grease on his hands and the most genuine smile I'd ever seen. We talked for 3 hours in that laundromat, and I knew before I left that something important had just happened in my life. Marcus worked as a mechanic at his uncle's auto shop, drove a 15-year-old pickup truck that he'd rebuilt himself, and lived in a small apartment above a diner in the older part of town. His clothes always smelled faintly of motor oil, his hands were permanently stained from years of working with engines, and he had never set foot inside a country club. He was also the most intelligent, compassionate, hard-working man I'd ever met. Our first real date was at a food truck festival downtown. He knew the stories behind half the vendors because he'd helped them fix their generators or given them rides when their vehicles broke down. Marcus had this way of making everyone around him feel important, from the teenager serving tacos to the elderly man selling handmade jewelry. He listened when people talked, remembered details about their lives, and showed up when they needed help. Within a month, I was completely in love with him. Within 3 months, I'd started bringing him around my family, and that's when the problems began. My parents didn't say anything directly at first. They just exchanged those little glances that parents think their children don't notice. When Marcus would leave after Sunday dinner, my mother would immediately start cleaning imaginary messes, and my father would make comments about different backgrounds and lifestyle compatibility. The breaking point came when I invited Marcus to my cousin's wedding. He bought a new suit, spent extra time getting ready, and was nothing but polite and charming to everyone he met. But I caught my mother apologizing to relatives for his situation, and my father spent the entire reception introducing him as Jessica's friend instead of her boyfriend. After that, family gatherings became exercises in damage control. I'd brief Marcus on who was going to be there, what topics to avoid, and which relatives might ask uncomfortable questions about his career plans or educational background. He handled it all with more grace than they deserved, but I could see how it affected him. The worst part was watching him try to fit into their world. Marcus started researching topics he thought would interest my father. He'd read business magazines and prepare talking points about the stock market or local politics. He'd dress more formally for family events and speak more carefully, like he was constantly translating himself into a language my parents would approve of. But nothing he did was ever enough. If he was quiet, they'd say he was antisocial. If he joined conversations, they'd find ways to highlight how little he knew about their social circle. When he brought wine to dinner, my mother would comment on the price range. When he offered to help with dishes, she'd insist he didn't know where things belonged. The breaking point arrived in the form of my brother Kevin's engagement party. Kevin had proposed to Amanda Harrison during a romantic weekend in Napa Valley, and my parents were absolutely thrilled. Not just because Kevin was happy, but because marrying into the Harrison family would cement our social standing in Riverside for generations. The engagement party was planned as the social event of the season. My mother spent 3 months organizing every detail, from the flower arrangements to the guest list. She rented the main ballroom at the Riverside Country Club, hired a string, quartet, and invited everyone who mattered in our community. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, city council members. If they had influence in Riverside, they received an engraved invitation. 2 weeks before the party, my mother pulled me aside for what she called a little chat. We were sitting in her perfectly decorated living room, sipping tea from china cups that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. "Jessica, honey," she began in that tone that always meant trouble, "I want to talk to you about the engagement party." "What about it?" "Well, it's just that this is such an important event for our family. Kevin's future in-laws will be there, along with all of Dad's colleagues and my committee members. The guest list is really quite distinguished." I could see where this was heading, but I made her say it anyway. And I'm wondering if Marcus might be more comfortable if he didn't attend. Not because we don't like him, she added quickly, but because he might feel out of place. These events can be overwhelming for people who aren't used to them. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. She wanted me to uninvite my boyfriend from my brother's engagement party because she was embarrassed by him. Not because he'd done anything wrong or inappropriate, but because he didn't fit her image of who belonged in our social circle. "Marcus is my boyfriend, Mom. Of course he's coming with me." Her smile became strained. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I just think it might be easier for everyone if you came alone. You could spend time with your cousins, and Marcus could have a nice quiet evening at home. No. Jessica, please don't make this difficult. Think about what's best for the key family. I am thinking about what's best for my family. Marcus is part of that. The conversation ended in a stalemate, but I knew the battle lines had been drawn. My parents had decided that Marcus was an embarrassment, and they were willing to exclude him from family events to avoid having to defend their daughter's choice in men. I told Marcus about the conversation that night. We were sitting on his couch, sharing Chinese takeout and watching old movies, and I was so angry I could barely eat. "Maybe I should skip it," he said quietly. "Absolutely not. You're not missing my brother's engagement party because my parents are snobs. Jess, I don't want to cause problems with your family." "You're not causing problems. They are." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. Marcus had grown up in a family where love was unconditional and support was automatic. His parents had divorced when he was young, but both sides of his family had always welcomed me with open arms. His uncle Jose treated me like a daughter. His grandmother insisted on packing extra food whenever I visited, and his teenage cousins had adopted me as their honorary big sister. The contrast with my own family was becoming impossible to ignore, and I knew it was wearing on both of us. The night of the engagement party arrived with all the pomp and circumstance my mother had planned. The Riverside Country Club looked like something from a movie, with crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and enough flowers to stock a florist shop. A string quartet played classical music near the bar, and waiters in crisp uniforms circulated, with champagne and catered appetizers. Marcus had bought a new tie specifically for the occasion and spent extra time getting ready. He looked handsome and nervous, like he was preparing for a job interview rather than a family celebration. I wore a navy blue dress my mother had helped me pick out, along with the pearl earrings she'd given me for graduation. We arrived fashionably late, hoping to blend into the crowd rather than make a grand entrance. The ballroom was already full, of Riverside's most prominent residents, all dressed in their finest clothes and speaking in the carefully modulated tones of people who were very aware of being seen. I spotted my parents near the head table, accepting congratulations and playing the role of proud hosts. Kevin and Amanda were holding court by the bar, surrounded by friends and relatives eager to hear about wedding plans and honeymoon destinations. The whole scene felt choreographed, like everyone was playing parts in a performance designed to showcase our family's success and social status. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Marcus and I made small talk with my cousins, complimented the decorations, and sampled the catered food. He was charming and polite, asking thoughtful questions about people's work and families, and I started to relax. Maybe my parents would see how wonderful he was. Maybe this would be the night they finally accepted him. I should have known better. The trouble started during the toasts. My father had planned a series of speeches celebrating Kevin and Amanda's engagement, with contributions from both families and several close friends. As the evening's host, he would go first, followed by Amanda's father, then Kevin himself. My father stood up near the head table and tapped his champagne glass with a silver knife. The room gradually quieted as conversations died and all attention focused on him. He looked confident and distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, every inch the successful community leader. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate a very special occasion. Kevin and Amanda's engagement represents not just the union of two wonderful young people, but the joining of two families who share the same values and commitment to our community. The crowd murmured appreciation, and I felt Marcus shift beside me. Something in my father's tone was making me nervous, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Both Patricia and I are incredibly proud of the man Kevin has become. He's built a successful career, established himself as a leader in our community, and now he's chosen a partner who shares his vision for the future. We couldn't be happier about this match. More applause. Amanda beamed from her place beside Kevin, and my mother looked like she might cry from pride. Everything was going exactly according to script. Then my father's gaze found me across the room, and his expression shifted slightly. Of course, as parents, we know that our children don't always make the choices we might hope for. Sometimes they need time to mature, to figure out what they really want from life. but we love them anyway, and we keep hoping they'll eventually find their way to the right path. My stomach dropped. He wasn't talking about Kevin anymore. Patricia and I have learned that parenting means accepting our children's decisions, even when those decisions are. He paused, seeming to search for the right word. Challenging for the family? I felt Marcus go rigid beside me. Around us, people were starting to look confused, unsure where this toast was heading. My father's smile had taken on a sharp edge that I recognized from childhood. The expression he wore when he was about to deliver a lecture disguised as wisdom. And that's when I realized that my worst fears about this night were about to come true. My father was about to turn my brother's engagement party into a public commentary on my relationship choices. In front of 150 of the most influential people in Riverside, he was going to humiliate the man I loved and shame me for standing by him. The only question was how far he was willing to go. As it turned out, the answer was further than I could have possibly imagined. My father cleared his throat and continued his toast, his voice carrying easily across the hushed ballroom. The string quartet had stopped playing, and even the waiters had paused their service to listen. Every eye in the room was focused on him, waiting to see where this unexpected turn in his speech would lead. You know, raising children teaches you that love sometimes means accepting difficult truths, he said, his gaze still fixed on me across the crowded room. Sometimes it means watching your child make choices that you know will only lead to disappointment. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as conversations around nearby tables died completely. Marcus's hand found mine under the white tablecloth, his fingers warm but trembling slightly. I could see my cousin Sarah at the next table, her eyes wide with horror as she realized what was happening. Take my daughter Jessica, for example, my father continued, raising his champagne glass slightly in my direction. She's always marched, to the beat of her own drum, as they say, always chosen the more challenging path. A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. I caught my mother's eye across the room, expecting to see disapproval or embarrassment. But instead, she was nodding along with my father's words, her perfectly lipsticked mouth curved in what looked almost like satisfaction. Jessica has been dating a young man for the past 2 years, my father announced to the assembled guests. A very hard-working young man, I'm sure. He fixes cars for a living. The way he said fixes cars made it sound like Marcus was doing something vaguely criminal. Around us, I could hear the subtle intake of breath that wealthy people make when they encounter something they consider beneath their social station. Mrs. Henderson from my mother's book club actually pressed her hand to her chest as if my father had announced that I was dating an axe murderer. Now, there's nothing wrong with honest work, my father continued, his tone suggesting that there was, in fact, everything wrong with it. But when you've spent your entire life providing your children with the best education money can buy, with opportunities to meet successful, accomplished people, with entry into the finest social circles, well, you can't help but wonder where you went wrong. I wanted to stand up and scream at him to stop, but my legs felt like they were made of concrete. Beside me, Marcus was staring down at his hands, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping. I knew he was fighting every instinct to either defend himself or simply walk out, and I loved him even more for his restraint. The young man is here tonight, actually, my father said, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on our table. Marcus, would you stand up? I think everyone should meet Jessica's boyfriend. The request was delivered with such casual authority that for a moment, even I thought Marcus might comply. The entire ballroom turned to look at us. 150 pairs of eyes suddenly focused on our table like spotlights. I heard someone whisper, "Which one is he?" And someone else respond, "The one in the cheap suit." Marcus slowly pushed back his chair and stood up. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that he'd styled carefully for tonight, and brown eyes that usually sparkled with warmth and humor. Tonight, those eyes looked guarded, almost resigned, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. "There he is," my father said with false cheer. "Marcus Rodriguez, everyone. Jessica's. Well, I suppose we'll call him her boyfriend, though. At their age, that term seems a bit juvenile, doesn't it?" A few people chuckled, and I felt something cold and sharp twist in my stomach. This wasn't just disapproval anymore. This was deliberate cruelty, performed for an audience that my father knew would appreciate the show. "Marcus, tell everyone what you do for work," my father called out across the room. I watched Marcus's throat work as he swallowed hard. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but quiet. "I'm a mechanic, sir." "A mechanic," my father repeated, as if the word was exotic and fascinating. How wonderful, very practical, very blue collar. More nervous laughter from the crowd. I could see Amanda Harrison looking uncomfortable near the head table, tugging on Kevin's sleeve and whispering something in his ear. But Kevin was watching the show with what looked like amusement, and he certainly wasn't trying to stop our father. "And Marcus, what kind of car do you drive?" my father asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and found it entertaining. "A 2009 Ford F-150, sir." "A pickup truck. How practical for your line of work. I imagine it's quite useful for carrying your tools around." The condescension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. I finally found my voice and stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "Dad, that's enough," I said, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom. But my father held up one hand, still smiling. "Now, Jessica, I'm just getting to know your young man better. We're all family here, after all." He turned back to Marcus, who was still standing beside our table like he was facing a firing squad. "Marcus, I'm curious about something. When you picked Jessica up tonight, did you take the service entrance? I only ask because that truck of yours is quite distinctive." I felt my face burn with shame and rage. Not shame for Marcus, but shame for my father, for my family, for every person in this room who was sitting silently and allowing this to happen. Marcus had driven us here in his truck because his uncle was borrowing his more formal car for a date. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but my father was twisting it into something shameful. "No, sir," Marcus replied quietly. "We used the main entrance." "Oh, well, I suppose that's fine. Though I do hope you parked in the back lot. The valet service here is really designed for different types of vehicles." At this point, several people in the crowd were openly laughing. Not kind laughter, but the sharp, exclusionary kind that wealthy people use to remind everyone of their place in the social hierarchy. I could see Mrs. Patterson from the country club board covering her, mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles. Dr. Williams from my father's medical group was grinning broadly and nudging his wife. My mother chose that moment to join the conversation. She stood up gracefully from her seat at the head table, her silver dress catching the light from the chandeliers. Patricia Miller was a master of social warfare, and I could see from her expression that she was about to deploy her most sophisticated weapons. "Richard, darling, you're being too hard on the boy," she said, her voice carrying the false sweetness she used when she was about to deliver a particularly devastating blow. "Marcus is actually quite accomplished in his field. Why, just last week he fixed Mrs. Chen's washing machine at the laundromat, completely free of charge." She said this as if she were announcing that Marcus had won a Nobel Prize. The effect was exactly what she intended. It made his kindness sound quaint and his skills sound trivial. "And he's so good with his hands," she continued, examining her perfectly manicured nails as she spoke. "Jessica tells me he can fix almost anything mechanical. Very useful skills to have around the house." The implication was clear. Marcus was useful in the same way that a handyman or gardener might be useful. Someone you hired for manual labor, not someone you brought to social events or introduced to your peers. Kevin finally decided to join the family roast. My brother stood up from his place beside Amanda, his face flushed from champagne and the excitement of being the center of attention. Kevin had always been competitive with me, but I'd never seen him be deliberately cruel before tonight. "You know what, Marcus?" Kevin called out, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Since you're here, maybe you could take a look at Dad's BMW after the party. It's been making this weird noise, and the dealership wants to charge him a fortune to diagnose it." The laughter that followed was louder and more confident now. People were beginning to realize that this wasn't just an awkward family moment. It was entertainment, a public demonstration of social hierarchy that they were invited to enjoy. "Oh, that's a wonderful idea," my mother exclaimed, clapping. Her hands together as if Kevin had suggested something genuinely brilliant. "Marcus, you could use the service bay behind the kitchen. I'm sure the staff wouldn't mind if you borrowed some tools." I felt Marcus stiffen beside me. The suggestion that he would work on cars at a social event, that he would be relegated to the service areas like hired help, was so insulting that even some of the more decent people in the crowd were starting to look uncomfortable. But my family wasn't finished yet. "Actually," my father said, warming to his theme, "that raises an interesting question. Marcus, what are your long-term career goals? Do you plan to open your own garage someday? Maybe get a small business loan?" The question sounded innocent enough, but I knew my father well enough to recognize the trap. He was setting Marcus up to reveal his lack of formal education, his modest financial circumstances, his absence of professional ambitions that would impress this crowd. Marcus looked at me for the first time since this ordeal had begun. I could see pain in his eyes, but also something else, a quiet dignity that no amount of humiliation could touch. He turned back to face my father and spoke clearly enough for everyone in the ballroom to hear. "I'm satisfied with my current career, sir. I find it fulfilling to help people solve problems and keep their vehicles running safely." It was a perfectly respectable answer, but my father pounced on it immediately. "How admirable, a man satisfied with simple pleasures. But surely you must have some ambitions beyond mechanical work? Some dreams of advancement, of building something larger than yourself?" The implication was obvious. Marcus lacked ambition, vision, the drive to better himself that successful people were supposed to possess. In this crowd, being satisfied with blue-collar work was tantamount to admitting failure. "I think everyone should follow their passion," Marcus replied diplomatically. "Yes, passion," my mother chimed in. "How romantic. Though I do worry about practical matters. Jessica has been accustomed to a certain standard of living, you understand. Private, schools, nice cars, annual vacations to Europe. I'm sure you can appreciate how a mother might be concerned about her daughter's future financial security." The attack was so elegantly delivered that it took me a moment to process how vicious it was. My mother had just publicly suggested that Marcus was too poor to provide for me, while simultaneously reminding everyone in the room about my family's wealth and status. She'd managed to insult him while bragging about herself. "Mom, stop it," I said sharply, but my voice seemed to disappear into the vast space of the ballroom. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not criticizing," my mother said with that same false sweetness. "I'm just being practical. Money isn't everything, of course, but it certainly helps when you're planning a future together. Things like buying a house, having children, saving for retirement. These are important considerations." She was painting a picture of domestic poverty, of a future where I would have to sacrifice the comfortable life I'd grown up with because I'd chosen love over financial security. To this crowd of wealthy professionals, it probably sounded like a cautionary tale about the dangers of marrying beneath your social class. Dr. Harrison, Amanda's father and the most powerful attorney in Riverside, had been watching this spectacle with growing interest. He was a man who understood power dynamics, who knew exactly what my parents were doing and why. When he stood up from his table near the front of the room, everyone immediately turned to listen. Thomas Harrison's opinion carried more weight than anyone else's in Riverside's social hierarchy. "Richard, Patricia," he said in his courtroom voice, which could command attention from the back row of any venue. "This has been quite illuminating." I couldn't tell from his tone whether he approved or disapproved of my family's behavior. Dr. Harrison was famously difficult to read, which was part of what made him such an effective attorney. He could keep his thoughts hidden until the moment he chose to reveal them. "I've been listening to this conversation with great interest," he continued, walking slowly toward our table. "It's always fascinating to observe how families interact, how they choose to present themselves in public settings." My father preened slightly at what he took to be approval from Riverside's most influential resident. "Well, Tom, you know how it is with children. Sometimes tough love is the only way to help them see reality clearly." "Oh, I understand completely," Dr. Harrison replied. "Reality is indeed important. Facts matter. Truth has a way of surfacing, particularly in public forums like this one." He had reached our table now and was standing directly across from Marcus, studying him with the intense focus he usually reserved for hostile witnesses. I felt my heart pounding as I waited to see which side of this conflict he would support. "Marcus Rodriguez," he said thoughtfully, as if testing the name. "That's an interesting name. Familiar somehow." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir." "Rodriguez," Dr. Harrison repeated. "You know, I've been reading about a young attorney named Rodriguez recently. Marcus Rodriguez, if I'm not mistaken. He's been making quite a name for himself in legal circles. Brilliant work, from what I hear." The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the waiters seemed to freeze in place. My father's confident smile flickered slightly. "I'm sorry, Tom, but I think there's been some confusion. Marcus here is a mechanic, not a lawyer." Dr. Harrison pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be recent news articles. How odd, because I'm looking at a story from last month about a landmark legal victory in a tenants' rights case. Rodriguez versus Pinnacle Properties. The attorney who won that case was Marcus Rodriguez, recent graduate of Stanford Law School. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Marcus hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but something in his posture had shifted. The resignation was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that I'd never seen before. "Stanford Law School," Dr. Harrison continued, still reading from his phone. "Graduated summa cum laude 3 years ago. Turned down offers from 3 major firms to work as a public defender, representing families who couldn't afford legal representation." My mother's face had gone completely white. Kevin was staring at Marcus like he was seeing a stranger. Around the ballroom, guests were leaning forward in their chairs, trying to process this unexpected revelation. "According to this article," Dr. Harrison went on, "Attorney Rodriguez has won 12 major cases in the past 18 months, saving dozens of families from wrongful eviction. He's been doing pro bono work while, volunteering at his uncle's auto repair shop in his spare time to help support his family." The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. Marcus wasn't just a mechanic who happened to be intelligent and well-spoken. He was a Stanford-educated attorney who had chosen public service over private profit, who spent his weekends teaching automotive skills to teenagers and helping his uncle's business, who had never mentioned his legal career because he didn't need to prove his worth to anyone. Dr. Harrison looked up from his phone and addressed the silent ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've been in the presence of one of the most accomplished young attorneys in California, and we've spent the evening treating him like hired help." The shame that settled over the room was almost tangible. People, who had been laughing and sneering moments earlier, were now studying their champagne glasses with sudden fascination. The social hierarchy that had seemed so solid and permanent just minutes ago had been completely inverted. But Dr. Harrison wasn't finished yet. "Marcus," he said, turning to face my boyfriend directly. "I've been following your work with great interest. That Pinnacle Properties case was brilliant. The way you constructed the argument around tenant protection laws was masterful. I don't suppose you'd be interested in discussing a position with Harrison and Associates. We've been looking for an attorney with your particular skills and ethical commitment." The job offer hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Harrison and Associates was the most prestigious law firm in Riverside, the kind of place where junior partners drove Mercedes and senior partners owned vacation homes in Aspen. It was exactly the sort of opportunity that my parents' social circle would kill for, and Dr. Harrison was offering it to the man they'd just spent 20 minutes publicly humiliating. Marcus looked at Dr. Harrison for a long moment, and I could see something shifting in his expression. The careful mask of politeness he'd worn all evening was finally slipping away, revealing the confident, accomplished man I knew him to be. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that I'd heard in our private conversations, but never in front of my family. "Dr. Harrison, I appreciate the offer more than you know. But before we discuss my career, I think there are some misconceptions in this room that need to be addressed." He turned to face my father, and for the first time all evening, Marcus looked like the Stanford-educated attorney he was, rather than the apologetic boyfriend my family had been trying to diminish. "Dr. Miller, you asked about my long-term goals earlier. You seemed curious about whether I had any ambitions beyond what you called mechanical work. I think it's time I gave you a complete answer." The ballroom was so quiet that I could hear the ice shifting in people's drinks. My father's confident smile had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of growing dread as he began to understand that the evening was about to take a very different turn. 3 years ago, I graduated from Stanford Law School with highest honors, Marcus continued, his voice carrying easily across the hushed room. I was recruited by several top-tier firms in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Sullivan and Cromwell offered me a starting salary of $250,000. Cravath made an even better offer. I watched my mother's eyes widen as she processed numbers that represented more money than most people in Riverside made in several years. Around the room, guests were exchanging glances as they recalculated everything they thought they knew about the man they'd been looking down on all evening. "I turned down all of those offers," Marcus said simply. "Instead, I chose to work as a public defender because I believe that everyone deserves quality legal representation, regardless of their ability to pay. It's a choice I've never regretted." Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly. "A noble decision. Not many young attorneys have the courage to prioritize service over profit." "The work has been incredibly fulfilling," Marcus continued. "In the past 3 years, I've represented over 200 clients. I've saved families from losing their homes, helped small business owners fight predatory lending practices, and ensured that low-income defendants received fair trials. Last month, as Dr. Harrison mentioned, I won a case that protected 12 families from wrongful eviction." Kevin was staring at Marcus like he was looking at a completely different person. My brother had built his entire identity around being the successful, accomplished Miller child, and he was clearly struggling to process the fact that my boyfriend, the man he'd just mocked as unsuitable, had achievements that dwarfed his own. "But Marcus," my mother said weakly, "if you're a lawyer, why do you work at that garage? Why do you drive that old truck?" Marcus's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "Mrs. Miller, I work at my uncle's shop because family is important to me. My uncle Jose raised me after my father left, and he's getting older. He needs help with the business, and I'm happy to provide it. As for the truck, it runs perfectly well, and I rebuilt the engine myself. I don't see any reason to replace something that works simply to impress other people." The contrast between Marcus's values and my family's priorities was becoming painfully clear. While my parents measured success by external markers, expensive cars, prestigious addresses, designer clothes, Marcus had chosen a path that prioritized service, family loyalty, and personal integrity. Dr. Harrison was studying Marcus with obvious admiration. The Rodriguez versus Pinnacle Properties case, I read about that in the legal journals. The way you structured the argument around California's tenant protection statutes was brilliant. You managed to create binding precedent that will protect renters across the state. Thank you, sir. That case was particularly meaningful to me because it involved families very similar to the ones I grew up with. Working-class people who were being taken advantage of by wealthy landlords who assumed they wouldn't have the resources to fight back. The irony was impossible to miss. Marcus had built his legal career defending people like himself against people like my family, wealthy, privileged individuals who used their power to exploit those with fewer resources. And here he was, standing in a ballroom full of Riverside's elite after they'd spent the evening treating him exactly like the landlords he sued. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Marcus, I had no idea about your background. If you'd mentioned that you were an attorney— With respect, Dr. Miller, Marcus interrupted. I shouldn't have to mention my professional credentials to be treated with basic human dignity. The fact that I'm a lawyer doesn't make me any more worthy of respect than I was when you thought I was just a mechanic. The rebuke was delivered so calmly that it took a moment for its full impact to register. Marcus wasn't just defending himself. He was challenging the entire value system that my family and their social circle use to judge other people. He was suggesting that a person's worth had nothing to do with their job title or their income level. Around the ballroom, I could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. These were individuals who had built their entire social hierarchy around professional achievement and material success, and Marcus was quietly dismantling the foundations of that system. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, and I could see that he was genuinely angry now. Not at Marcus, but at my family and everyone else who had participated in the evening's humiliation. Ladies and gentlemen, he said in the commanding tone he used when addressing juries, what we've witnessed tonight is a disgrace. We've allowed a young man of extraordinary accomplishment and character to be publicly mocked simply because he chose to dress modestly and work with his hands in his spare time. The shame in the room was now so thick you could practically taste it. People who had been laughing and sneering just minutes earlier were now avoiding eye contact and staring at their plates. Marcus Rodriguez, Dr. Harrison continued, has achieved more in 3 years than most attorneys accomplish in their entire careers. He's won cases that have improved the lives of hundreds of families. He's turned down lucrative opportunities to serve the public good. And instead of recognizing and celebrating these achievements, we've chosen to judge him based on the age of his truck and the grease under his fingernails. My mother was crying now, though I wasn't sure whether it was from shame or from the realization that she'd just publicly insulted someone who could potentially become one of the most powerful attorneys in Riverside. Patricia Miller was many things, but she wasn't stupid. She understood power and influence, and she was beginning to grasp the magnitude of her mistake. Dr. Harrison is right, said a voice from the back of the room. I turned to see Judge Martinez, one of the most respected figures in Riverside's legal community, standing up from his table. I've had the privilege of observing Attorney Rodriguez in my courtroom on several occasions. His advocacy for his clients has been exemplary, and his legal scholarship is impressive. Other voices began to join in. Dr. Peterson, who ran the largest medical practice in town after my father's, stood up and said, Marcus, I had no idea about your background. Please accept my apologies for any offense caused tonight. One by one, the most prominent people in the room were standing up to acknowledge Marcus and distance themselves from my family's behavior. It was like watching a political revolution in miniature. Power structures that had seemed permanent were suddenly shifting as people recalculated their loyalties. But the most important moment came when Amanda Harrison, Kevin's fiancée, walked across the ballroom to where Marcus was standing. Amanda was usually quiet at social events, content to let Kevin take the spotlight, but tonight she looked determined and slightly angry. Marcus, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I want to apologize on behalf of everyone here who participated in or tolerated what happened tonight. Your work as a public defender is exactly the kind of service that our community needs more of, and you deserved better from all of us. Then she turned to face my brother, her own fiancé, with an expression that could have frozen champagne. Kevin, I'm appalled by your behavior tonight. The man you've been mocking has done more to help people in need than you've ever even attempted. If this is how you treat people you consider beneath your social status, then I'm going to have to seriously reconsider whether we share the same values. Kevin's face went white. In the space of an hour, he'd gone from being the celebrated guest of honor to being publicly called out by his own fiancée. The golden boy of the Miller family was suddenly facing the possibility that his cruelty might cost him his engagement. Amanda, wait, Kevin said desperately. I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, Amanda shot back. You didn't know anything about Marcus, but you felt perfectly comfortable humiliating him anyway. What does that say about your character? Dr. Harrison was watching this exchange with obvious approval. His daughter had just demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and social awareness that he'd tried to instill in her, and she'd done it by defending the man who might soon be joining his law firm. Marcus, meanwhile, was handling all of this attention with remarkable grace. He wasn't gloating or seeking revenge. He was simply standing there with quiet dignity, letting the truth speak for itself. Mrs. Harrison, he said to Amanda, I appreciate your support more than you know, but I don't need anyone to apologize for Kevin's behavior. He's capable of making his own choices and taking responsibility for them. It was a masterclass in taking the high road. Instead of pressing his advantage or humiliating Kevin further, Marcus was offering him a chance to redeem himself. It was the kind of generous response that only someone with genuine confidence and security could make. Dr. Harrison stepped forward again, this time addressing Marcus directly. I meant what I said earlier about joining our firm. We've been looking for someone with your skills and ethical commitment for quite some time. Would you be willing to discuss the position seriously? I'm honored by the offer, Dr. Harrison, but I'm happy with my current work. Public defense is more than a job for me. It's a calling. I understand completely. But what if I told you that we've been considering expanding our pro bono program? We've been looking for someone to head up a new division focused on tenant rights, employment law, and other issues affecting working families. It would allow you to continue serving the same population you're helping now, but with significantly more resources at your disposal. I could see Marcus considering this seriously. The opportunity to help more people with better funding and support was clearly appealing to him, even if the prestige of joining Harrison and Associates wasn't. That's an intriguing possibility, Marcus admitted. I'd be interested in learning more about your vision for that program. Excellent. Why don't we schedule a meeting for early next week? You can tour our offices, meet the team, and we can discuss the details. As they exchanged contact information, I realized that my family's attempt to humiliate Marcus had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of driving him away or making him feel unwelcome in Riverside social circles, they'd inadvertently introduced him to the most powerful attorney in town and potentially launched his career to an entirely new level. But the personal consequences for my family were just beginning to unfold. My father was standing near the head table looking lost and confused, like a general who'd just realized that his battle plan had resulted in complete defeat. The man who'd started the evening as the confident host of Riverside's social event of the season was now facing the possibility that his reputation in the community might never recover. Richard, Dr. Harrison said, approaching my father with the same cold formality he used with opposing counsel in court, I think we need to have a conversation about tonight's events. Tom, I had no idea about Marcus's background. If I'd known he was an attorney. That's not the point, Dr. Harrison interrupted sharply. The point is that you publicly humiliated a guest in your own home, someone your daughter cares about, without knowing anything about his character or accomplishments. That kind of behavior reflects poorly on your judgment and your values. My father's medical practice depended heavily on referrals from Dr. Harrison and his associates. Many of his wealthiest patients came to him because the Harrison family recommended his services. The possibility that this relationship might be damaged was clearly terrifying to him. Furthermore, Dr. Harrison continued, several people in this room tonight are my clients and colleagues. They've all witnessed how you choose to treat people you consider socially inferior. That raises questions about your character that I'll need to consider carefully. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Dr. Harrison was suggesting that my father's behavior tonight might affect his standing in the community and, by extension, his business prospects. My mother was hovering nearby, clearly desperate to salvage the situation. Tom, please understand, we were just concerned about Jessica's future. We want what's best for her. What's best for Jessica, Dr. Harrison replied coldly, is apparently a man of exceptional character and accomplishment who chose to love her despite the obvious dysfunction in her family. If you can't see that, then the problem isn't with Marcus. It's with your judgment. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other prominent attorneys who had been at the party. Word was spreading quickly through the legal community about Marcus's identity and the evening's events, and people were eager to introduce themselves to the young attorney who had made such an impression. Marcus Rodriguez, called out Jennifer Walsh, one of the partners at the second-largest firm in Riverside. I've been following your work on tenants' rights cases. Absolutely brilliant stuff. I'd love to discuss some potential collaboration opportunities. Soon, Marcus was surrounded by some of the most influential legal minds in the region, all eager to network with the man my family had been treating like an embarrassment just an hour earlier. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. I stood back and watched as my boyfriend, who had started the evening being mocked for his old truck and his work clothes, became the center of attention for all the right reasons. Every conversation I overheard was about his legal victories, his ethical standards, or his impressive academic record. Meanwhile, my family was being systematically isolated. People who had been eager to chat with my parents earlier in the evening were now keeping their distance, clearly uncomfortable with being associated with the night's hosts after their public display of cruelty. The transformation was complete and devastating. In the span of an hour, the social hierarchy that had seemed so fixed and permanent had been completely inverted. Marcus had gone from outcast to honored guest, while my family had gone from respected hosts to social pariahs. But the most important, change wasn't happening in the ballroom. It was happening inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I was seeing my family clearly, not as the successful, sophisticated people I'd always believed them to be, but as insecure, shallow individuals who used cruelty to maintain their sense of superiority. Tonight had revealed something ugly at the core of their values, something I could no longer ignore or excuse. Marcus appeared at my side, having extracted himself from the crowd of admirers who wanted to discuss legal strategies and career opportunities. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. "I should be asking you that question. I'm so sorry about what they did to you tonight." "Don't apologize for their choices, Jess. You're not responsible for their behavior. But I brought you here. I knew they disapproved of you, and I still subjected you to this." Marcus took my hand and squeezed it gently. "You brought me here because you wanted me to be part of your family's celebration. That was generous and loving. The fact that they chose to respond with cruelty says nothing about you and everything about them." Looking around the ballroom, I could see that the party was effectively over. Groups of guests were saying their goodbyes and heading for the exits, eager to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere that had settled over the event. The evening that was supposed to celebrate Kevin and Amanda's engagement had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging people by their appearance. Dr. Harrison approached us one final time before leaving. "Marcus, I'll have my assistant call you tomorrow to set up that meeting. I'm very excited about the possibility of working together." "Thank you, Dr. Harrison. I look forward to discussing your pro bono program." Then Dr. Harrison turned to me with a kind smile. "Jessica, you should be very proud of the man you've chosen." He handled tonight's situation with more grace and dignity than anyone had a right to expect. After he left, I looked around the nearly empty ballroom at my family, who were standing together near the head table looking shell-shocked and defeated. Part of me felt sorry for them, but a larger part of me felt something I'd never experienced before: freedom. For years, I'd been trying to bridge the gap between the man I loved and the family I'd been born into. Tonight had shown me that the gap wasn't something that could be bridged because it wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about fundamentally different ways of seeing the world and valuing other people. I could continue trying to make peace between two incompatible value systems, or I could choose the one that aligned with my own principles and conscience. For the first time in my life, the choice felt clear. 2 weeks after the engagement party, I was sitting in my apartment on a Sunday morning, drinking coffee and reading the Riverside Tribune's business section, when I saw the headline that changed everything. Local attorney joins Harrison and Associates, will head new social justice division. The article featured a photograph of Marcus shaking hands with Dr. Harrison outside the law firm's gleaming downtown offices. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that I'd never seen before, and his smile was confident and genuine. The article described his Stanford credentials, his impressive track record as a public defender, and his vision for expanding legal services to underserved communities in Riverside County. Reading about Marcus's success in the newspaper felt surreal, like discovering that someone you thought you knew well had been living a secret life. But it wasn't that Marcus had been hiding anything from me. It was that I'd been so focused on protecting him from my family's judgment that I'd never fully appreciated the magnitude of his accomplishments. The article went on to detail the Harrison firm's new pro bono initiative, which would provide free legal services to low-income families facing eviction, workplace discrimination, and other civil rights violations. Marcus would be leading a team of 3 junior attorneys and 2 paralegals, with an annual budget that exceeded the entire operating costs of the public defender's office where he'd been working. Attorney Rodriguez brings a unique combination of legal excellence and moral conviction to this role, Dr. Harrison was quoted as saying. His commitment to justice and his understanding of the challenges facing working families make him the ideal person to head this initiative. I set down the newspaper and looked around my small apartment, trying to process how dramatically everything had changed. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had been the embarrassing boyfriend my parents were ashamed to introduce to their friends. Now he was being featured on the front page of the business section as one of Riverside's most promising young professionals. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Jessica, we need to talk. Can you come for dinner tonight, Dad? And I have some things we'd like to discuss with you." I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. In the 2 weeks since the engagement party, my parents had been attempting damage control with varying degrees of success. My father had called Marcus's office twice to schedule a meeting, only to be told that Attorney Rodriguez was too busy to see him. My mother had sent flowers to our apartment with a note that said, "We're so proud of Marcus's achievements and excited to welcome him properly to our family." The attempts at reconciliation felt hollow and self-serving. My parents weren't sorry for how they'd treated Marcus. They were sorry that their treatment had backfired so spectacularly. They weren't interested in making amends because they'd recognized the error of their ways. They were interested in associating themselves with Marcus now that he'd become successful and influential. I texted back, "I'll come, but Marcus will be with me. If that's a problem, we can postpone until you're ready to treat him with the respect he deserves." The response came back within minutes. "Of course Marcus is welcome. We're looking forward to seeing both of you." That evening, Marcus and I drove to my childhood home in his pickup truck, which he'd kept despite Dr. Harrison's gentle suggestion that a partner at Harrison and Associates might want to consider upgrading his vehicle. Marcus had laughed and said that the truck ran perfectly well, and reminded him of important things about who he was and where he'd come from. My parents' house looked exactly the same as always. Perfectly manicured lawn, expensive cars in the driveway, every detail designed to project success and sophistication. But walking up to the front door felt different this time. I wasn't arriving as the apologetic daughter hoping her family would accept her boyfriend. I was arriving as an adult woman who had made her choice and was prepared to defend it. My mother answered the door wearing her most expensive dress and her brightest smile. "Jessica, Marcus, we're so delighted you could come. Please come in, come in." The performance was almost comical in its transparency. Patricia Miller, who 3 weeks ago had suggested that Marcus use the service entrance, was now treating him like visiting royalty. She took his jacket, offered him drinks, and guided us into the formal living room where my father was waiting. Dr. Richard Miller stood up when we entered, extending his hand toward Marcus with the sort of formal courtesy usually reserved for important patients or colleagues. "Marcus, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I've been following your career developments with great interest." Marcus shook his hand politely, but without warmth. "Dr. Miller." We all sat down in the uncomfortable chairs that my mother had chosen more for their appearance than their comfort, and for several minutes, no one seemed to know what to say. The elephant in the room, my parents' behavior at the engagement party, loomed over the conversation like a thundercloud. Finally, my father cleared his throat and began what was obviously a prepared speech. "Marcus, I owe you a sincere apology for my behavior at Kevin's engagement party. I made assumptions about you that were both wrong and inappropriate, and I'm deeply sorry for any embarrassment or hurt that my words may have caused." It was the sort of careful, lawyer-reviewed apology that admitted fault while minimizing culpability. My father was sorry for making assumptions, but he wasn't acknowledging the deliberate cruelty of his actions or the pain he'd inflicted. Marcus listened politely and then said, "I appreciate that, Dr. Miller." He didn't say he accepted the apology, I noticed. He just acknowledged that it had been offered. My mother jumped in with her own version of contrition. "Marcus, I hope you can understand that we were just concerned about Jessica's happiness. We didn't know about your background, and we were worried about her future security. If we'd known you were an attorney from Stanford—" "Mrs. Miller," Marcus interrupted gently. "With respect, that's exactly the problem. You were worried about Jessica's future security, but you never asked me about my goals or my capabilities. You made judgments based on my appearance and my weekend activities, without bothering to learn anything about who I actually am." The observation was delivered so calmly that it took a moment for its full impact to register. Marcus wasn't just pointing out that my parents had been wrong about his credentials. He was challenging their entire approach to evaluating other people. "You're absolutely right," my father said quickly. "We should have gotten to know you better before forming any opinions. But more than that," Marcus continued, "I shouldn't have needed impressive credentials to be treated with basic respect. The fact that I'm a Stanford-educated attorney doesn't make me any more worthy of courtesy than I was when you thought I was just a mechanic." My parents exchanged glances, clearly struggling with this concept. In their world, professional achievement and social status were the primary measures of a person's worth. The idea that someone deserved respect regardless of their job title or income level was foreign to their way of thinking. Kevin arrived while we were having this conversation, looking nervous and apologetic. My brother had been trying to repair his relationship with Amanda ever since the engagement party, with limited success. Amanda had moved back in with her parents and was insisting on couples counseling before they proceeded with wedding plans. "Marcus," Kevin said as soon as he walked into the room, "I'm glad you're here. I've been wanting to talk to you." He sat down across from us and launched into his own apology, which was more genuine than our parents had been. Kevin acknowledged that his behavior had been cruel and inexcusable, and he seemed to understand that he'd damaged not just his relationship with Marcus, but his reputation in the community. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Kevin said. I realized that I was threatened by you. Here I was, supposedly the successful son, and you walked in with more real accomplishments than I'd ever achieved. Instead of being impressed or trying to learn from you, I chose to tear you down. It was a more honest assessment than I'd expected from my brother, and I could see that Marcus was taking it seriously. I appreciate your honesty, Kevin, Marcus said, and I hope you and Amanda can work things out. She's a good person who deserves someone who shares her values. The implication was clear. Kevin needed to prove that he was worthy of Amanda, not the other way around. Over dinner, the conversation gradually became more natural. My parents asked Marcus about his work at Harrison and Associates, and he described the cases he was taking on and the families he was helping. They listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, though I suspected they were also calculating how his rising status might benefit their own social standing. Marcus, for his part, was gracious, but not effusive. He answered their questions and engaged in polite conversation, but he didn't go out of his way to charm them or seek their approval. The dynamic had shifted fundamentally. My parents were now the ones trying to impress him, rather than the other way around. After dinner, my father asked to speak with Marcus privately in his study. I watched them disappear down the hallway, wondering what sort of man-to-man conversation my father had in mind. When they returned 20 minutes later, both men looked satisfied, but not particularly warm. My father shook Marcus's hand again and said, I'm glad we had a chance to talk. On the drive home, I asked Marcus what my father had wanted to discuss. He offered to refer patients to me for any legal needs they might have, Marcus said with a slight smile. Medical malpractice defense, contract disputes, estate planning. He also mentioned that he plays golf with several other doctors who might be interested in my services. I almost laughed at the transparency of it. My father, having realized that Marcus was now a potentially valuable business contact, was trying to position himself as an ally and partner. The same man who had publicly mocked Marcus's profession 3 weeks ago was now eager to profit from his legal expertise. What did you tell him? I told him I'd keep it in mind. I was polite, but I think he understood that our relationship is going to be cordial rather than close. Over the following months, my family gradually adjusted to the new reality. My parents began including Marcus in family gatherings and social events, though their acceptance felt more like recognition of his status than genuine affection. They treated him with the sort of careful respect usually reserved for important business associates. Polite, but not particularly warm. Kevin and Amanda eventually worked through their issues and rescheduled their wedding for the following spring. Amanda insisted that Marcus be included in the wedding party as one of Kevin's groomsmen, which my brother accepted with what appeared to be genuine gratitude for the second chance. My relationship with my family evolved as well. I continued to attend family dinners and holiday celebrations, but I no longer felt obligated to seek their approval or worry about their opinions. The engagement party had been a watershed moment that clarified my priorities and freed me from the need to please people whose values I didn't share. Marcus thrived in his new position at Harrison and Associates. Within 6 months, his social justice division had helped dozens of families avoid eviction, secured settlements for workers who had been discriminated against, and established legal precedents that would protect vulnerable populations throughout the county. Local newspapers regularly featured stories about his cases, and he was invited to speak at conferences and law schools about innovative approaches to public interest law. But the changes in our personal life were even more significant than his professional success. With his new salary and signing bonus, Marcus was able to move out of his apartment above the diner and into a beautiful house in one of Riverside's most desirable neighborhoods. He chose a place with a large garage where he could continue working on cars as a hobby and a guest suite for when his uncle Jose came to visit. He also finally bought a new car, not because anyone pressured him to, but because he decided he wanted something more comfortable for his daily commute to the law office. He kept the pickup truck, though, for weekend projects and trips to the hardware store. One evening in late spring, almost a year after the engagement party, Marcus and I were sitting on the deck of his new house, watching the sunset and talking about our future together. He had been hinting for weeks that he had something important to discuss with me, and I had a feeling I knew what it might be. "Jess," he said, taking my hand, "this past year has shown me a lot about what really matters in life. Family, values, choosing the people who see you clearly and love you anyway." I felt my heart start to race as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Your family's acceptance means something to me now, but it's not essential to my happiness. Your love and respect mean everything. Will you marry me?" The ring was perfect, not the largest diamond or the most expensive setting, but exactly what I would have chosen for myself. Simple, elegant, and meaningful rather than ostentatious. "Yes," I said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Of course, yes." 6 months later, we had our own engagement party. Unlike Kevin's elaborate affair at the country club, we chose to celebrate at Marcus's uncle's garage, which we decorated with string lights and filled with folding tables and home-cooked food. The guest list included Marcus's family, my closest, friends, his colleagues from the law firm, and families whose lives he had changed through his legal work. My parents attended, dressed more casually than I'd ever seen them at a social event, and seemed to genuinely enjoy themselves. They spent most of the evening talking with Dr. Harrison and his wife, clearly pleased to be associated with Riverside's most prominent legal family. But the most important guests were the people whose stories reminded me why I'd fallen in love with Marcus in the first place. There was Mrs. Chen from the laundromat, who brought homemade dumplings and insisted on hugging everyone she met. There was the Rodriguez family, whose home Marcus had saved from foreclosure, and the young woman whose workplace discrimination case had resulted in policy changes at her company. These were people who knew Marcus not as the successful attorney he'd become, but as the kind, generous person he'd always been. They had loved and respected him when he was working as a public defender and volunteering at his uncle's garage, and they celebrated his success now without any sense that his worth had changed along with his circumstances. As I looked around the garage at this unlikely collection of guests, wealthy attorneys chatting with auto mechanics, my suburban parents sharing a table with recent immigrants whose English was still limited, teenagers from Marcus's mentorship, program taking selfies with judges and law professors, I realized that this was what real family looked like. Not the manufactured perfection of country club events and carefully curated guest lists, but genuine connections between people who saw each other clearly and chose love over judgment. Marcus found me near the dessert table and wrapped his arms around me from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about how grateful I am for that night at the country club," I said. "As awful as it was, it showed me who you really are and who my family really is. It forced me to choose between two different ways of living, and I chose correctly." He turned me around to face him, smiling. We chose correctly, together. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone home and we were cleaning up, with help from both our families, Dr. Harrison approached us with a serious expression. "Marcus, I have a proposition for you," he said. "The State Bar Association has asked me to recommend someone for their new Commission on Legal Aid Reform. It's a 2-year appointment that would involve traveling to Sacramento regularly and working with legislators to improve access to justice for low-income Californians." Marcus's eyes lit up with interest. "That sounds like exactly the kind of work I want to be doing." The position would be prestigious and influential, but it would also be demanding. You'd be representing not just our firm, but the entire legal profession's commitment to public service. I squeezed Marcus's hand, knowing that this was the kind of opportunity he'd been preparing for his entire career. The boy who'd grown up in a working-class family and put himself through law school was being offered a chance to influence policy at the state level. "I'm very interested," Marcus said. "When would I need to start?" the commission convenes in January, which means you'd have time to plan a honeymoon before diving into this new challenge. That night, as Marcus and I sat in our beautifully imperfect engagement party cleanup, surrounded by dirty dishes and leftover cake, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a woman caught between her family's expectations and her own heart, afraid to fully choose either path. Tonight, I was engaged to a man who was about to influence legal policy for the entire state of California, surrounded by people who loved us for who we were, rather than what we represented, planning a future built on shared values rather than social expectations. The engagement party that was supposed to destroy us had actually saved us. It had forced every important truth into the open and allowed us to build something real on that foundation. Marcus reached over and took my hand, the simple engagement ring catching the light from the string bulbs we'd strung around the garage. Ready to start planning a wedding? I looked around at the evidence of our celebration. Marcus's Uncle Jose teaching my mother how to fold empanadas, Kevin helping teenage mentees load leftover food into their cars, my father deep in conversation with a family court judge about immigration law, and I realized that we'd already created something more valuable than any wedding. We'd created a life where love mattered more than status, where character counted more than credentials, and where family was defined by choice rather than obligation. I'm ready for all of it, I said. The wedding, the marriage, the commission, work. The whole beautiful, complicated future we're going to build together. Bow, because that's what happens when you finally stop trying to fit into someone else's definition of success and start building your own. You discover that the life you're brave enough to choose is always better than the one you're expected to. Except, 18 months after our engagement, I stood in the bridal suite of the Riverside Botanical Gardens, adjusting the cathedral-length veil that had belonged to Marcus's grandmother. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting everything in a warm, golden glow that seemed to promise good things ahead. Unlike my mother's elaborate preparations for Kevin's engagement party, my wedding morning was peaceful and intimate. My maid of honor was Sarah, my college roommate who had witnessed every step of my relationship with Marcus. Amanda was there too, having become a genuine friend rather than just a future sister-in-law. Even Mrs. Chen from the laundromat had insisted on helping me get ready, bringing a small blue ribbon that her own grandmother had carried for luck. My wedding dress was vintage lace that I'd found at a boutique in downtown Riverside, elegant but not ostentatious. It felt like me in a way that the designer gowns my mother had initially suggested never could. Marcus had laughed when I told him about her horror at my choice, saying he'd fallen in love with a woman who valued authenticity over appearances, and he wasn't about to start wanting her to change now. The venue itself was a deliberate choice that reflected our values. Instead of the country club or one of Riverside's other prestigious locations, we'd chosen the Botanical Gardens where Marcus and I had had our first official date. It was beautiful and meaningful, but it was also accessible to all of our guests, regardless of their economic circumstances. As I put in the pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's, I thought about how different this day felt from any event my family had ever hosted. There was no anxiety about impressing the right people or maintaining appearances. There was only anticipation for celebrating love with the people who mattered most to us. A gentle knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called, expecting to see Sarah with a last-minute detail, or my mother with some well-meaning but unnecessary advice. Instead, Marcus's Uncle Jose stepped into the room, wearing the new suit that Marcus had insisted on buying him for the occasion. Jose had been the father figure in Marcus's life since he was 12 years old, and he would be walking me down the aisle since my own father had forfeited that honor through his behavior at Kevin's engagement party. "Mija," Jose said, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "You look beautiful. Marcus is a lucky man, but I think you already know that." "Thank you, Uncle Jose, and thank you for agreeing to walk with me today. It means everything to have you there." Jose had been hesitant when I first asked him, worried that he wasn't distinguished enough for such an important role. It had taken weeks of gentle persuasion from both Marcus and me to convince him that his character and love mattered more than any social credentials. "I have something for you," Jose said, reaching into his jacket pocket. It belonged to Marcus's grandmother, the one whose veil you're wearing. She always said it should go to the woman who made Marcus truly happy. He handed me a delicate bracelet made of silver and small emeralds, clearly handmade but exquisite in its craftsmanship. As he fastened it around my wrist, I felt connected to the long line of strong women who had shaped the man I was about to marry. "She would have loved you," Jose said softly. She always told Marcus to find a woman who saw his heart before anything else. She said those were the only ones worth keeping. 20 minutes later, I was standing at the entrance to the garden ceremony space, my arm linked through Jose's, waiting for the music to begin. Through the ornate iron gates, I could see our 120 guests seated in wooden chairs arranged in a semicircle around the gazebo where Marcus was waiting. The guest list itself told the story of our unconventional love. In the front rows sat both of our families, but also Mrs. Chen and her extended family, the Rodriguez clan that Marcus had helped save from foreclosure, several teenagers from his mentorship program, and colleagues from both the Public Defender's Office and Harrison and Associates. Dr. Harrison was there with his wife, serving as Marcus's best man in recognition of the friendship that had developed between them over the past year. Amanda sat with Kevin, who had spent the last 18 months proving that he was capable of genuine growth and change. My parents were in the third row, dressed appropriately for the occasion and appearing to actually enjoy themselves. But the most important guest was Judge Martinez, who had volunteered to officiate our ceremony. Judge Martinez had known Marcus since his first day in court as a public defender, and he'd watched him grow into one of the most respected attorneys in the region. Having him perform our wedding felt like receiving a blessing from the legal community that had become our chosen family. The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's canon, and Jose squeezed my arm gently. "Ready, mija?" I've never been more ready for anything in my life. As we walked down the petal-strewn path between the seated guests, I felt overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding us. These weren't people who had come to our wedding because they felt obligated or because they wanted to be seen at the right social event. These were people who genuinely cared about Marcus and me, who had watched our relationship grow and flourish, who wanted to witness this next chapter of our story. Marcus was standing at the gazebo in a charcoal gray suit that complemented his dark hair and warm brown eyes. When he saw me, his face lit up with such pure joy that I felt tears start to gather in my eyes. This was the man who had endured public humiliation with grace, who had achieved extraordinary success while maintaining his humility, who had loved me through every challenge and celebration. Judge Martinez began the ceremony with words that felt personal and meaningful rather than generic and ceremonial. He talked about love as a choice that couples make every day, about the importance of shared values and mutual respect, about building a partnership that could weather any storm. When it came time for our vows, Marcus spoke first. His voice was clear and confident as he promised to love me not just in moments of triumph, but in times of difficulty and doubt. He promised to support my dreams even when they took us in unexpected directions, to treat my family with kindness even when kindness wasn't reciprocated, and to build a life with me based on truth and trust rather than appearances and expectations. My own vows focused on gratitude. Gratitude for his patience during the long process of learning to stand up to my family. Gratitude for his example of how to live with integrity. Gratitude for showing me that love didn't require changing yourself to please other people. I promised to be his partner in all the good work he wanted to do in the world, to support his dreams of making the legal system more just and accessible, and to never again allow anyone to diminish him in my presence. When Judge Martinez pronounced us husband and wife, The garden erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to echo off the surrounding trees. Marcus kissed me with such tenderness that I forgot we had an audience, lost in the moment of finally being married to the man who had changed my understanding of what love could be. The reception was held in the garden's main pavilion, decorated with fairy lights and local flowers that created an atmosphere of rustic elegance. Instead of a formal sit-down dinner, we'd chosen a buffet featuring dishes from several of our favorite local restaurants, including the diner where Marcus used to live and the Mexican bakery owned by his cousin. Our first dance was to At Last by Etta James, chosen not because it was trendy or sophisticated, but because it perfectly captured how we both felt about finding each other after years of searching for someone who understood us completely. As we swayed together in the center of the pavilion, surrounded by the warm glow of string lights and the soft murmur of our guests' conversations, I felt a sense of peace and rightness that I'd never experienced before. The evening was full of small moments that revealed the true nature of our community. I watched my father deep in conversation with Jose about the challenges of raising children in different economic circumstances, both men finding common ground in their love for the people they'd helped raise. My mother was sitting with Marcus's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, learning to fold paper flowers for the centerpieces, and laughing at stories about Marcus as a teenager. Kevin gave a toast that surprised everyone with its sincerity and self-reflection. He talked about learning that true success wasn't measured by external achievements, but by the positive impact you had on other people's lives. He acknowledged that Marcus had taught him important lessons about character and humility, and he thanked both of us for giving him the chance to grow and change. Dr. Harrison spoke about Marcus's work on the state commission, which had already resulted in legislation that would expand legal aid funding throughout California. He announced that the governor had asked Marcus to consider a position as special advisor on criminal justice reform, a role that would give him even more influence over policy at the state level. But the most meaningful speech came from one of Marcus's former clients, a young mother named Sophia, whose family had been facing eviction when Marcus took their case. Sophia had learned English specifically so she could speak at our wedding, and her words about how Marcus had saved her children's home brought tears to nearly every eye in the pavilion. "Attorney Rodriguez didn't just help us keep our house," Sophia said in carefully practiced English. "He showed us that there are good people in this world who will fight for families like ours. He gave us hope when we had none, and he never made us feel ashamed for needing help." As the evening progressed, I noticed something remarkable happening. The various communities that made up our guest list were beginning to blend and connect in unexpected ways. Teenagers from Marcus's mentorship program were teaching Amanda's law school friends how to salsa dance. Mrs. Chen was sharing recipes with the caterers from the Mexican restaurant. My college friends were deep in conversation with Marcus's colleagues about social justice initiatives. It was exactly what Marcus and I had hoped for, not just a celebration of our marriage, but a demonstration that people from different backgrounds and circumstances could find common ground when they approached each other with openness and respect. Around 10 o'clock, as the evening was winding down and guests were beginning to say their goodbyes, my mother approached me near the dessert table. She looked elegant in her navy blue dress, but more relaxed than I'd seen her at a social event in years. "Jessica, sweetheart, this has been a beautiful wedding. Everything about it has been perfect." "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot coming from you. I want you to know that I've learned something important tonight. I've been watching Marcus with all these different people, seeing how much they love and respect him, and I finally understand what I couldn't see before." She paused, looking around the pavilion at the diverse group of guests who were still chatting and laughing together. True character isn't about having the right credentials or knowing the right people. It's about how you treat everyone you meet, especially people who can't do anything for you in return. Marcus has that kind of character, and I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize it. It was the first genuinely heartfelt apology my mother had ever given me, and I could see that it was costing her something to admit she'd been wrong. For Patricia Miller, Acknowledging error was almost as difficult as admitting weakness. I'm glad you can see that now, Mom. It means everything to me that you understand why I love him. I do understand. And I want you to know that your father and I are proud to have him as our son-in-law. We're proud of both of you for building something real and meaningful together. Later that night, after all the guests had gone home and the vendors had finished cleaning up, Marcus and I sat alone in the garden gazebo where we'd been married just hours earlier. We were still in our wedding clothes, but my shoes were off and his tie was loosened, and we were sharing a bottle of champagne that Dr. Harrison had given us as a wedding gift. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Rodriguez?" Marcus asked, refilling my glass. "It feels like coming home," I said honestly, "like I've finally found where I belong. Even with all the complications that come with my family and my work and my complete inability to fit into traditional social expectations," I laughed and leaned against his shoulder. Especially because of all that, I fell in love with a man who chooses principle over profit, family loyalty over social climbing, and authentic relationships over networking opportunities. Why would I want you to change any of that? Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden where fairy lights were still twinkling in the trees. "You know, a year and a half ago, sitting in that country club ballroom while your family tried to humiliate me, I never could have imagined that we'd end up here." "Really? I could. Even in that horrible moment, I knew you were worth fighting for. I knew that anyone who could handle that situation with such grace and dignity was someone I wanted to spend my life with. What made you so sure?" I thought about it carefully, wanting to give him an honest answer. "It was watching how you treated everyone that night, even the people who were hurting you. You were kind to the waiters, polite to the guests who were laughing at you, protective of me even when I wasn't doing a good job of protecting you. You showed me what real strength looks like." Marcus turned to face me, taking my hands in his. "I want you to know that everything we've built together, this marriage, our community, the work we're both doing, none of it would have been possible without your courage that night. You chose love over family approval, authenticity over social expectations. That choice made everything else possible." 6 months after our wedding, Marcus was officially appointed as special advisor to the governor on criminal justice reform. The position required us to split our time between Riverside and Sacramento, but it also gave Marcus a platform to influence policy on a scale he'd only dreamed of as a young public defender. His first major initiative focused on expanding legal aid services to rural communities that had been underserved for decades. The program he designed would place recent law school graduates in small towns throughout California, providing them with student loan forgiveness in exchange for 3 years of public service. I had started my own consulting firm, helping nonprofit organizations develop sustainable funding strategies and community partnerships. My first major client was the organization that ran Marcus's former mentorship program, and I was able to help them secure grants that tripled their annual budget. Our life together wasn't always easy. Marcus's work often required long hours and difficult travel, and my business was growing faster than I'd anticipated. But it was deeply satisfying in ways that my old life had never been. We were building something meaningful together, using our skills and resources to make positive changes in our community and beyond. One evening in late fall, almost 2 years after that transformative engagement party, Marcus and I were having dinner at the small Mexican restaurant where we'd had our second date. It had become a monthly tradition, a way of remembering where we'd started and appreciating how far we'd come. "I have news," Marcus said, grinning at me across the small table. "The governor wants me to head up a new task force on prison reform. It would be a 2-year appointment, and it would involve working with legislators, corrections officials, and advocacy groups to develop comprehensive reforms." I felt a thrill of excitement for him. This was exactly the kind of work he'd been preparing for his entire career, the chance to address systemic injustices at the highest levels of government. "Marcus, that's incredible. When would you start?" "January. But there's more. The position comes with a significant budget for hiring staff and consultants. I was hoping you might be interested in serving as the task force's community engagement coordinator. The offer was unexpected and exciting. It would mean working together on issues we both cared deeply about, using my skills in nonprofit management to build partnerships with community organizations throughout the state. Are you sure it's a good idea for us to work together professionally? We're still newlyweds. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. I can't think of anyone I'd rather have as a partner in this work. You understand the mission, you have the skills we need, and you're not afraid to tell me when I'm wrong about something. I laughed, thinking about all the ways our relationship had prepared us for this kind of collaboration. We'd already weathered family disapproval, social pressure, and the challenges of building a life together while maintaining our individual ambitions. Working together to reform California's criminal justice system felt like a natural next step. Yes, I said. Absolutely, yes. That night, as we walked home through the quiet streets of downtown Riverside, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been a woman torn between family expectations and personal happiness, afraid to fully commit to either path. Tonight, I was walking hand in hand with my husband toward a future dedicated to service and justice. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without pain. Learning to stand up to my family, watching Marcus endure public humiliation, navigating the complex dynamics of forgiveness and accountability, all of these experiences had challenged us and changed us in fundamental ways. But every difficult moment had been worth it for this. The ability to wake up each morning knowing that our life together was built on shared values and mutual respect, that our work was making a positive difference in the world, that our love had been tested and proven strong enough to withstand any challenge. As we reached our front door, Marcus stopped and turned to face me. Do you ever regret it? Choosing this life over the easier path your family wanted for you? I looked at him standing there in the porch light, this brilliant, compassionate man who had changed my understanding of what was possible when you chose love over convenience, principle over profit, authenticity over appearances. Never, I said. Not for a single second. Because that's what happens when you finally stop trying to live someone else's definition of success and start building your own. You discover that the courage to choose love, even when love is complicated and challenging, leads to a life more beautiful and meaningful than anything you could have imagined. The family that had once been embarrassed by Marcus now bragged about him to their friends. The community that had once looked down on him now sought his guidance and expertise. The woman who had once been afraid to defend him had become his partner in changing the world. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from proving that their judgment was irrelevant all along. Sometimes the best revenge is living a life so authentic and meaningful that those who tried to diminish you are forced to recognize their own emptiness in comparison. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, love really does conquer all. 5 years after that life-changing engagement party, I stood in the conference room of the state capitol building in Sacramento, watching Marcus present his comprehensive prison reform proposal to a bipartisan committee of legislators. The room was packed with reporters, advocacy groups, corrections officials, and family members of incarcerated individuals, all waiting to hear the recommendations that could reshape California's criminal justice system. Marcus had spent 2 years traveling throughout the state, visiting prisons, interviewing inmates and their families, consulting with wardens and guards, and studying successful reform models from other states. The report he was presenting represented thousands of hours of research and hundreds of personal stories that had shaped his understanding of what true justice reform could look like. "Honorable committee members," Marcus began, his voice carrying the same quiet authority I'd first heard in that country club ballroom years ago. "The data is clear. Our current system is failing everyone it touches. It's failing the victims, who deserve meaningful accountability. It's failing the communities that need genuine safety. It's failing the families torn apart by cycles of incarceration. And it's failing the taxpayers who fund a system that costs $60 billion annually, while producing a 70% recidivism rate. I watched from the gallery as he outlined his recommendations: expanded education and job training programs, restorative justice initiatives that brought offenders face to face with the impact of their crimes, mental health and addiction treatment, services and transitional housing programs that would help former inmates reintegrate into society successfully. The proposal wasn't just theoretical. Marcus had already implemented pilot programs in 12 counties, and the results were remarkable. Recidivism rates had dropped by 40% in communities that embraced the full reform package, while victim satisfaction with the justice process had increased dramatically. These reforms require an initial investment, Marcus continued, clicking to a slide that showed projected costs and savings over 10 years. But the long-term financial benefits are substantial. More importantly, the human benefits are incalculable. We're talking about breaking cycles of crime and incarceration that have devastated communities for generations. When he finished his presentation, the committee chair, Senator Williams, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is impressive work. How confident are you that these reforms can be scaled statewide?" "Senator, I'm confident because I've seen them work. I've met former gang members who are now running successful businesses. I've talked to victims who found healing through restorative justice processes. I've visited families who stayed together because we provided alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenders. The evidence is overwhelming that this approach works when communities commit to implementing it fully." The questions that followed were thorough and sometimes skeptical, but Marcus answered each one with the combination of expertise and passion that had made him one of the most respected voices in criminal justice reform. When the hearing concluded, committee members from both parties approached him to discuss implementation timelines and funding mechanisms. As we walked out of the Capitol building that afternoon, Marcus was surrounded by reporters wanting quotes for their evening broadcasts and newspaper articles. The reform package was expected to pass with strong bipartisan support, which meant Marcus's work would soon affect the lives of millions of Californians. "How does it feel to know that your ideas are about to become state law?" asked a reporter from the Los Angeles Times. Marcus paused, considering the question carefully. "It feels like a responsibility more than an achievement. Every reform we implement will affect real people, incarcerated individuals hoping for a second chance, families waiting for their loved ones to come home, communities working to heal from decades of trauma. The real measure of success won't be whether the legislation passes, but whether these changes actually improve people's lives." That evening, we celebrated at a small restaurant near our Sacramento apartment with the core team that had worked on the reform proposal. The group included former public defenders, social workers, formerly incarcerated advocates, and policy researchers who had spent the last 2 years documenting what worked and what didn't in criminal justice reform. During dinner, Maria Santos, a formerly incarcerated woman who had become one of the state's most effective reentry advocates, stood up to make a toast. 5 years ago, I was serving my second sentence for drug possession, convinced that I would never be anything more than a statistic in the system. Then I met Marcus Rodriguez, who was just a public defender back then, working on my appeal. She looked directly at Marcus, her eyes bright with emotion. "You didn't just help me get out of prison. You helped me believe that I could build a different life. You connected me with education programs, helped me find housing. And when I said I wanted to help other women in similar situations, you found funding for my first community program." Maria's organization now operated in 15 cities throughout California, providing comprehensive reentry services for women leaving the correctional system. Her success story had been featured in national media, and she'd testified before Congress about the importance of supporting formerly incarcerated individuals. The reforms we're celebrating tonight aren't just policy changes, Maria continued. They're investments in human potential. They're acknowledgments that people can change, that communities can heal, that justice can mean restoration instead of just punishment. As the evening progressed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The man who had been publicly humiliated for fixing cars on weekends was now shaping policy that would affect the entire state. The woman who had been afraid to stand up to her family was now running a consulting firm that helped nonprofits secure millions of dollars in funding for social justice initiatives. But the changes weren't just professional. The personal transformations had been just as remarkable. My relationship with my family had evolved into something I never could have imagined during those difficult early years. My parents had genuinely learned to see beyond surface appearances and social status. They now regularly attended events, supporting Marcus's work, and my mother had even joined the board of a nonprofit that provided legal aid to immigrant families. Kevin and Amanda had weathered their relationship crisis and emerged as thoughtful, engaged community members. Kevin had left his high-paying financial advisory job to work for a credit union that specialized in providing affordable loans to low-income families. Amanda had started a legal clinic that offered free family law services to domestic violence survivors. The transformation in my family's values had rippled out into their broader social circle. Several of their country club friends had been inspired to volunteer with organizations that Marcus had introduced them to, and the Riverside Country Club now hosted an annual fundraiser for criminal justice reform that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. Even more significant was the network of relationships that Marcus and I had built together. Our wedding guests from 5 years ago had become an extended family of activists, advocates, attorneys, and community organizers who supported each other's work and celebrated each other's successes. Mrs. Chen had expanded her laundromat into a community center that offered English classes, job training, and childcare services. Jose had retired from the auto repair business and now worked part-time for Marcus's mentorship program, teaching automotive skills to young people while sharing stories about the importance of education and hard work. The teenagers who had been in Marcus's original mentorship program were now college graduates and young professionals, many of them working in public service careers inspired by his example. Several had gone to law school with the goal of following in his footsteps, and 2 were currently working as interns in our criminal justice reform office. 3 months after the legislation passed, Marcus received a call that would change our lives once again. The U.S. Department of Justice wanted to offer him a position as Deputy Assistant Attorney General, overseeing criminal justice reform initiatives at the federal level. It would mean moving to Washington, Marcus told me that evening as we walked along the Sacramento River. And it would mean an even more demanding schedule than what we're dealing with now. I thought about the opportunity and what it would mean for both of us. My consulting firm was thriving, with clients throughout California and several other states. Moving to Washington would mean starting over professionally, but it would also mean the chance to work on issues that affected the entire country. "What does your gut tell you?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, watching the water flow past us in the fading light. "My gut tells me that this is the opportunity I've been preparing for my entire career. The chance to influence federal policy, to help implement reforms in states that are struggling with the same issues we've addressed here. Then we should do it. We've always said that our work is more important than our comfort, and this sounds like the ultimate chance to make a difference." 6 months later, we were living in a small house in Arlington, Virginia, and Marcus was working in the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building, developing federal guidelines for prison, reform and reentry programs. I had started a new consulting practice focused on helping federal agencies improve their community engagement strategies. The work was demanding and sometimes frustrating. Federal bureaucracy moved much more slowly than state-level initiatives, and there were more political considerations to navigate. But Marcus was able to implement pilot programs in 20 states. and early results suggested that the California model could be adapted successfully to different regional contexts. On a cold February morning, almost exactly 6 years after that engagement party disaster, Marcus called me from his office with news that made both of us cry with joy. "The president wants to announce a national criminal justice reform initiative," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "She's going to propose federal funding for comprehensive reform programs in all 50 states, based on the model we developed in California." The announcement would be made at a White House ceremony, with Marcus serving as one of the key speakers alongside formerly incarcerated advocates, victims' rights representatives, and law enforcement officials who supported reform efforts. "Jessica, this is it. This is the chance to change the entire system, not just in California or a few pilot states, but everywhere. We're talking about millions of people whose lives could be affected by these reforms." The White House ceremony took place on a sunny, spring morning with hundreds of guests gathered in the Rose Garden. I sat in the front row watching Marcus stand alongside the President of the United States, knowing that the shy young man who had once been humiliated for working in his uncle's garage was now helping to shape national policy. But the most meaningful moment came after the official ceremony, during the reception in the East Room. A young woman approached Marcus with tears in her eyes, carrying a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. "Mr. Rodriguez, you probably don't remember me, but you represented my husband 3 years ago in a drug case in Los Angeles. Because of your work, he got treatment instead of prison time. He's been clean for 2 years now, and we just got married last month." She gestured to the baby in her arms. "This is Marcus Jr. We named him after you because you saved our family. My husband has a job now. We have our own apartment, and our son is going to grow up with his father." Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the tiny boy who bore his name. "What's your husband doing now?" "He's working as a counselor at the same treatment center where he got help. He wants to help other people the way you helped him." That night, back in our Arlington home, Marcus and I sat on our small back porch talking about the day's events and what they meant for the future. The federal reform initiative would take years to implement fully, but early projections suggested it could reduce incarceration rates by 30% while improving public safety outcomes. "Do you ever think about that night at the country club?" Marcus asked. "About how different our lives might have been if your family had succeeded in driving us apart?" I thought about the question seriously. "Sometimes, but I don't think they ever really could have succeeded. By the time of that party, I already knew who you were and what you meant to me. Their behavior just clarified the choice I needed to make." "What choice was that?" "The choice between living authentically or living for other people's approval, between choosing love or choosing status, between building something real or maintaining something artificial." Marcus reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "I'm grateful every day that you chose us. Everything we've been able to accomplish, all the lives we've been able to touch, none of it would have been possible without your courage that night. And I'm grateful that you showed me what real integrity looks like. Before I met you, I thought success meant impressing the right people and accumulating the right credentials. You taught me that success means using whatever talents you have to make other people's lives better." 2 years later, the National Criminal Justice Reform Initiative had been implemented in 35 states, with the remaining 15 scheduled to join the program within the next year. Recidivism rates were dropping nationwide, prison populations were stabilizing, and communities that had been devastated by decades of mass incarceration were beginning to heal. Marcus had been promoted to Assistant Attorney General, making him one of the youngest people ever to hold such a senior position in the Department of Justice. I had expanded my consulting practice into a nonprofit organization that helped communities navigate the complex process of implementing criminal justice reforms. But our proudest achievement was the Marcus Rodriguez Institute for Justice Reform, which we had established at Stanford Law School to train the next generation of public interest attorneys. The institute offered full scholarships to law students committed to public service careers, along with hands-on training in community-based justice initiatives. The first class of Rodriguez Fellows included 12 students from diverse backgrounds, many of them the first in their families to attend law school. They would spend their summers working in public defender offices, legal aid clinics, and community organizations before graduating with both the skills and the passion needed to continue the work of reform. On the day of the Institute's opening ceremony, we stood in the beautiful law school building where Marcus had studied a decade earlier, surrounded by current students, faculty members, and graduates who had been inspired by his example to pursue careers in public service. Dean Patterson, who had taught Marcus constitutional law during his second year, introduced him to the packed auditorium. When Marcus Rodriguez was a student here, it was clear that he possessed both exceptional legal talent and an unwavering commitment to justice. What none of us anticipated was the scope of the impact he would have on our entire legal system. Marcus's speech that day focused not on his own achievements, but on the power of individuals to create systemic change when they commit themselves to serving others. He talked about the formerly incarcerated advocates who had shaped his understanding of what reform should look like, the victims who had taught him about the healing power of restorative justice, and the communities that had embraced new approaches to public safety. The work of justice reform isn't just about changing laws or policies, Marcus told the audience. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about helping people see that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, that every community has the capacity for healing, that our shared humanity is stronger than our differences. After the ceremony, we walked across the campus where Marcus had first developed his passion for using law as a tool for social change. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the oak trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the pathways, where he had once walked as an uncertain young law student. Did you ever imagine when you were studying here that you'd come back to establish an institute in your name? I asked. Marcus laughed, shaking his head. I was too busy trying to keep up with my coursework and figure out how to pay for groceries. I never imagined any of this. The career, the reforms, the recognition. I certainly never imagined that I'd meet someone who would love me enough to take on her entire family for my sake. You didn't take on my family. You won them over through the simple act of being yourself. That's your superpower, you know. You make people want to be better than they thought they could be. As we drove home that evening, I thought about the full circle our lives had taken. The man who had been mocked for his humble background and simple values had become a national leader in criminal justice reform. The woman who had been criticized for her poor choice in boyfriends had built a career helping communities implement the very reforms her husband had designed. But more than professional success, we had created a life of meaning and purpose together. We had shown that love really could overcome prejudice, that character really was more important than credentials, that authentic relationships really were stronger than social expectations. The family that had once been embarrassed by Marcus now spoke with pride about his work and their connection to it. The community that had once looked down on him now recognized him as one of their most distinguished representatives. The woman who had once been afraid to stand up for him had become his full partner in changing the world. Sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in personal achievements, but in the ripple effects of choices made with courage and conviction. Sometimes the best revenge against those who try to diminish you is living a life so meaningful and impactful that their judgment becomes irrelevant. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, choosing love over convention doesn't just change your own life. It changes the lives of millions of people you'll never meet, in ways you'll never fully know. That's the true legacy of standing up for what you believe in, even when everyone around you thinks you're making a mistake. That's the power of choosing authentic love over artificial approval. That's what happens when you finally stop apologizing for being yourself and start building the life you were meant to live. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.